And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, January 19th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. And today we're going to go to Anchorage, Alaska and talk with Alaska Public Radio Network News Director Lori Townsend about some issues on a little island way out there at the end of the United States and some issues regarding subsistence hunting and fishing up in the Yukon. Lori Townsend, thank you for joining with us on the Native News Update today.
Hi, Paul. Well, I have a couple of things to give you an update about today. One of them is the village of Savoonga, which is on St. Lawrence Island, and it's in the Bering Sea, about 36 miles or so off the coast of Siberia. So the people there are Siberian Yupik, although they call themselves St. Lawrence Island Yupik folks now because they've been there for so long that they consider themselves kind of their own entity now, their own Yupik community.
Are they U.S. citizens or are they Soviet citizens?
They are U.S. citizens, yes. And for a long time they were able to go back and forth to visit relatives. Excuse me. But there was a considerable amount of time that wasn't allowed because of the Cold War and then September 11th concerns. I think that it's a little easier for folks to visit now, and there is some efforts between Kotzebue and Siberian people sharing some of the dances and songs, Inupiaq folks and Yupik folks, looking at some of these lost dances that they've helped to bring back. Right. But anyway, I digress from the main topic.
Come back to that. I just want to ask a few questions because a lot of people aren't going to be familiar with it. Kotzebue is way out on that little thing that starts going out toward the Bering Straits.
Yeah,
or
the Alaska.
Maybe it's this way, but it's way out there and
above the Arctic Circle.
Okay, and the U.S. border or the last island is the island we're talking about, or fairly close to it, that's inhabited. And you're talking about 30-some miles to the Soviet Union then, or the border or something like that when you get out on those chains?
It's between 35 and 50 miles, something around there, by water. When you're on St. Lawrence Island in Gamble, you can, on a clear day, you can see the Siberian coast. So it's quite close. You can see
Vice
Russia.
Presidential material. They can see the foreign policy coast. But let me ask this question. How many people are we talking about in terms of population? And my understanding, they've had some kind of an outage way out on that island, and Alaska's got to do something about it.
Yeah, there's, I believe, about 600 people in Savoonga, and I'm not sure about the population of Gamble, probably a similar number of folks there. But in Savoonga, they were hit by real severe storms in the first part of January. And what happened was kind of an unusual situation where, because there wasn't enough ice buildup yet to hold off the incoming storms, a whole lot of sea spray, salt water, got picked up and flung into the power system, and it drove this salt spray up into the transformers and fried them. And so they were without power in many of the homes there for 3 or 4 days. It was very cold. People had to take shelter in the school, in the community centers. And the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, which is the entity that services about 56 villages and is in control of the power system at St. Lawrence Island, was out there working, putting in some temporary fixes until they could resolve this issue. But it took them a long time to figure out what to do to get that salt spray out of there. So they had to look at de-icing agents that airports use, but they didn't find anything that was benign enough for what they wanted to do. They were concerned about environmental impacts of spraying some kind of chemicals around that may impact the folks that live there or the ground water. So they finally decided to just use water to wash it out with once they were able to do that. They do have the power restored now, but because there was extensive damage to numerous homes, the governor has declared it a state disaster, and and triggered individual assistance um, policies to help folks out there who have had damage to their water infrastructure.
So a couple hundred households were without electricity during that time period. Is this a snow machine, a snow sled community? You got to fly into it and those kinds of things?
You do have to fly in because of the fact that they're on an island. The closest airport is Nome. So people had to fly out from Nome to even help, and they couldn't get out there for a few days because the weather was so bad. They just couldn't fly out there. And so people had to take shelter where they could. About 150 people took shelter in the school for several days because they just didn't have any power at their own home.
I can just see Grandma getting out her Seal oil lamp and lighting it up and saying, "See what happens when you get dependent on electricity?"
Yeah, I wondered about that too, about what some of the more traditional folks there had to say about how it is. And I think it's a great illustration of how dependent all of us have become on modern conveniences. And there's a good recognition of that in a lot of the Native communities here in the state where people say, yeah, we want to certainly protect our traditional way of life because it's very, very important for so many reasons. But also, there's no going back to the way that it was 200 years ago. People like to have television. They like to have a light that you can turn on. And so it's tough to balance those things, especially in an extreme climate like Alaska.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's interesting about how you have to deal with these little enclaves of people way out at the far reaches of either the United States or Canada and some of the other communities, and especially when something like this happens, kind of an unnatural occurrence, and they lose their modern conveniences that fast, still got to respond to it.
That's right.
What else is, you got a big battle coming up having to do with subsistence in Alaska. This is an ongoing thing that's been going on, it seems to me, for many, many years. Can you give me a little bit of an outline of what the battle might shaping up to be up there, and where do the natives and subsistence hunters versus sportsmen fall into the whole scene?
Well, the Federal Subsistence Management Board is meeting right now in Anchorage for the next few days. And for folks unfamiliar with the system here in the state, because of the fact that the state constitution is out of compliance with the federal mandate of a priority use for rural residents in times of shortage, the federal managers had to come in and take over management of subsistence on all public lands. And so now we have a Federal Subsistence Management Board that has been put in place to look at these different regions. They have regional advisory councils made up of folks that live in those areas that help make recommendations for policies that affect fisheries and hunting. And right now there's a lot of concern about the resources on the Yukon River. And there's proposals in front of the board currently that would limit how much salmon can be sold. This customary and traditional trade does allow for some cash sales of subsistence resources because people need a little bit of cash to buy fuel.
Trade, subsistence sales versus commercial.
Exactly. But there are allegations that some folks have made many, many thousands of dollars selling fish illegally. There was one case cited of someone selling illegally subsistence fish to someone in Seattle that was a restaurant supplier. And that's not legal, primarily, I think, because of the concern over the fact that it's not going through an appropriate processing facility to make sure that the fish is handled properly. It's just being sold to this person in Seattle. And also, that's not what it was meant for. It was meant to help families have a little bit of cash. It was not meant to be a commercial enterprise. And the folks that I talked to at the last Subsistence Board meeting said that subsistence users themselves were reporting these incidents because they realized that if they don't police this very carefully, it will be impacted, and their ability and their right to harvest subsistence resources could be impacted. So they're very concerned about this, as well as the federal managers are. So there's proposals to limit the amount of commercial sales of subsistence or just the sales. It isn't supposed to be any commercial sales. I'm sorry, I mischaracterized that.
Right.
Just to limit the sales overall of subsistence resources. There's also proposals to cut way back the catch. There's a proposal in place, or a proposal being forwarded that would limit the ability to fish the runs, leaving out the first run of salmon for the next 12 years. This proposal's been put out there to not let anybody touch that, to try to help the resource regain, because it's fallen off quite a bit. And the escapement goals, the number of fish that have to make it through and get to Canada or to other tributaries, other places, has to be a certain number, and they've not met those goals in many respects. There's also concern over how much salmon is fed to people's teams, their dog teams, things like that, that people have used that to feed their dogs. It's expensive to feed dogs. Dog food, to have it shipped out to bush communities, is ridiculously expensive, and so this is part of how they fed their teams. Now, it's probable that a lot of these proposals won't go anywhere, but they'll be watched closely. And once these things start being put forward, then the likelihood is that some kind of concessions will have to be made. And there's a lot of concern between the upper and the lower Yukon about how they're going to share this resource.
Are some of those subsistence rights protected by treaty with tribes, or are the treaty tribes lacking in those kinds of documents like they do on the South 48?
Yeah, there's not really, all of the lands issues were dealt with between the agreement that was made in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and then the subsistence rights that were forwarded under the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, that came after that. Because in ANCSA, Aboriginal rights to hunting and fishing were extinguished. And people started to realize, wait a minute, this doesn't work, and we need to do something about it. And that's why Title 8 of ANILCA was put into place, so that people do have rights to customary, traditional harvest, gathering, and trade.
Is there a strong coalition between tribal subsistence users and non-native subsistence users versus commercial uses of the resources up there? Do you see an evolution of those people working together?
I think that there's always some tension between the urban and rural users. There's the Alaska Constitution says that all resources of the state are owned equally by all the people of the state. And that's where the problem comes in with the federal mandate of a subsistence priority in times of shortage. If there's only 500 caribou in an outlying area, and you have a limited number of permits because the resource is down, then the federal mandate says the people who most need that resource have the right to harvest it first. And then if there's extras left over, then other people from Anchorage or other urban centers can fly out there and shoot a caribou. So there's tension there, and I think that tension isn't going to go anywhere. There's some folks that understand and say, yeah, it makes sense that the people that don't live on a road system, that can't go to Costco to buy groceries, should have the right to have that resource first. But other people say, look, I'm looking at the state constitution. It says we're all equal here, so that's what I'm operating off. And I don't see how that will be resolved, because there's not the political will to take up that issue of amending the state constitution to meet the federal requirements. So it's always going to be an issue of contention, I think.
Okay. Thanks for joining with us today. Where can people find these stories and more, and the results of some of those discussions when you cover all that and get something into your file? Where can they go?
They can go to APRN.org for those stories and more, and the federal subsistence stories will be coming out in the next couple of days.
All right. Thanks, Lori.
Thanks.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. We want to thank you all for joining with us, and come back again real soon. Miigwech.